The story I'm going to read from tonight is called Divided We Fell. It's going to be coming out in March on Super Tuesday from Haverhill Hill Press. And it's an anthology of dystopian future horror. And all the proceeds from it are going to be donated to the ACLU. So I'm just very proud to be invited in. Thank you. I put some flyers out. I don't know if they're still there. If you want to learn a little more about it, you can also go to Haverhill Hill and find out some more about when it's coming out and all the authors in it. There's quite a table of contents. It's called the Dystopian, what are we calling it? The Dystopian States of America. Yes. All right, but this one's called Divide We Fell. And for some of you, I think you've heard it before, but hopefully most of you will be something a little new and different from me. You landed one of the good ones. Susan's 4 best friends, all probably dead now, used to exclaim various iterations of this whenever they get together for a ladies' night of wine, cheese, and gossip. It was always uttered in a jovial tone, but with a jealous undercurrent that used to stir such pride, as if she'd won the spousal sweepstakes. What a shame her married friends had to settle for their less handsome, charming, and successful men, or in the case of Shelley, failed at landing a husband entirely. She'd felt particularly bad for her, as Shelley didn't seem to realize what she was missing. Fool. She stirred the pot, her knees aching from kneeling on the stone hearth so long. Self-absorbed idiot. She wondered how long it used to take them to burst into laughter at her delusion. Probably the minute she headed out the door. Susie! Phil's voice jolted her back to their ugly present reality. He looked over his shoulder at her from in front of the living room's bay window. How's dinner coming? She rolled her eyes. Even with the no longer United States in ruins and living on borrowed time in their 2-bedroom ranch house come fortress, he expected her to have dinner ready after his hard day of work. And here she was, still trying to meet his expectations. The bay window had sold them on buying the house 17 years ago. Back then it had panes of glass and looked out on a lush front lawn and a little park across the quiet dead-end street. 3 weeks and 2 days ago, Phil had gazed out of it to see if the deer were nibbling on his neatly trimmed bushes. Now, he was making sure the nails he'd driven through thick panels of wood, repurposed from what used to be a solid oak dining room table, remained firmly in place. Last night's assault had been particularly vigorous. Guilt stirred, just like it always did whenever she'd become frustrated by Phil's expectations, even back when she was living in ignorance that they were anything but a blissful, quaintly traditional couple. Of course she would make dinner, do the laundry, and put the dishes in the dishwasher. Wasn't that the least she could do, considering she'd only been working as a customer service rep part-time, while Phil brought home the lion's share of their income? Phil had always been a decent provider, a top salesman for a major telecom firm, back when there were jobs and telecommunications. His career required extensive travel, so the poor man just wanted to relax whenever he was home. How could she reasonably expect him to do silly chores? Although I got tired, I wanted a break sometimes. Plus, how often did I take out the garbage because he forgot even when he was home? And considering what he was getting up to, it'll be ready in 5 minutes. Her tone was apologetic, and she hated herself for it. Phil grunted and went back to surveying the windows, then tested the multiple locks on the front door. He was performing his fundamental husbandly duties now, protecting his domain, his woman, from the things that tried to batter their way inside nightly. He was still one of the good ones, at least on that score. She lifted the pot off the burning chair legs, supplemented by books in their fireplace, and dipped the ladle into the pasta and tiny meatballs. She'd only used 1 can because Phil said it was getting harder to scavenge canned goods. Apparently enough of their neighbors had survived to raid the remains of the local shop and right, so he was going to have to hike out much farther to the shop and basket tomorrow and see if anything was left there. She blew on the ladle and touched it to her tongue, wondering what they would do when the inevitable happened and there were simply no more canned goods to be found. Would they have to figure out how to farm in the barren remains of their yard? And if so, with what seeds? Even if they somehow got vegetables to grow, their nightly visitors would rip them apart, just like they destroyed everything they came across, sentient or not. It's ready. She scooped the mushy pasta and chewy meatballs into 2 bowls. Phil came over to sit with her in front of the fireplace, and she handed him one of the spoons. He shoveled the limp food into his mouth. She knew it was a far cry from when she used to make sauce from scratch and serve it over perfectly al dente linguine, but he devoured it with the same zeal. Hungry beggars couldn't exactly be choosy. Again with the guilt. Maybe I should have taken a smaller portion. After all, he was a 6-foot-tall man who had to walk for miles to find them food every few days. All she had to do was choose and stack the books that would stoke the fire, keep the remaining interior of the house reasonably neat, make whatever Phil could find into edible meals, mend their clothes, menial tasks for which not a lot of fuel is required. Phil finished and set his bowl and spoon on the hearth. Thank you for dinner. Stiff, formal, like she was the help and he the proper lord of the manor. He rose and walked down the hall to finish his surveillance of the bedrooms while she finished dinner alone. She'd become used to having dinner alone, even before the country imploded. Phil had been traveling more than ever during the last months before the cold Civil War heated up. When he did make it home, he just wanted to eat in front of the television, watching the news station with which he agreed. Their exchanges were restrained to comments on commentators, excusing them from the deeper conversations they should have been having. God, I miss TV. Not the propaganda thinly disguised as news, but the fun stuff. What a great distractor it had been. Laugh tracks, car chases, scary pretend monsters and heroes who swept in to the rescue just in time. Wonderful, meaningless dialogue uttered by fake people in make-believe worlds far simpler and happier than theirs. Now all that remained was silence, haunted by the echoes of lost intimacy and mutual resentment. At least until night fell. By the light of the single stubby remains of a candle, she went into the kitchen and set their bowls in the sink. She added a capful of bottled water and a minuscule squirt of dish soap. The knocking began. She fumbled the bowl she'd been wiping, but managed to catch it before it could shatter on the countertop. After weeks of living with the nightly pounding by the things that wanted to come inside, she still nearly jumped out of her skin every single time. What are the odds we'll live long enough for me to ever get used to it? Not that there was really anything left to live for, as far as she knew. There was no way to know that for sure since the communications infrastructure had collapsed. But she knew in her heart that her friends and neighbors were either dead, changed, or doomed. Her father and kid brother, too. At least Mom had died before the idea of a second Civil War had ever been conceived. Survival hardly seemed worth the effort, feeling as miserable as she did, trapped in the ruins of her life with a man who'd let her down so profoundly. Only the presidents of the blue and red states had been capable of outdoing the devastation Phil had unleashed on their lives. Still, she had to fight the urge to run to Phil, beg him to hold her and say it was all going to be okay, that he'd protect her until this all passed. Even if he was lying, and he would be. She knew from experience he was skilled enough to convince her of anything. At first he'd offered that comfort, even though she'd been screaming at him hysterically just the day before the drop ended their country. Back then the wounds of his betrayal were too fresh for her to accept his embrace, his apologies hollow, because she knew he couldn't just leave anymore, the way he'd surely planned. Her shattered heart refused to accept his half-assed regret and proposal that they focus on the apocalypse outside. The world ending doesn't change the fact that you ruined our lives with your cliched midlife crisis and wandering dick. The words that flowed out of her, a river of bile. Stay the hell away from me. Like not touching my 46-year-old sagging ass could be considered punishment. He hadn't cared to touch her lovingly at all in the year prior to the drop, when the divided governments of the U.S. were merely engaging in battles of words via social and televised media. Back then, she'd attributed his neglect to depression and anxiety, which seemingly everyone had developed as the nation fell apart. A single comment on social media could turn neighbors and family and friends into mortal enemies, and did so with increasing frequency. So who could blame them? But then it turned out it was only his wife he didn't want anymore. He didn't have any problem getting it up for the knocking spread. More fists, or whatever the changed ones used to demand entry, joined the effort. She swallowed hard and tried to concentrate on wiping the bowls and silverware. My God, why can't I just stop thinking about it? How can I still care about Phil's betrayal with literal death right outside? She shook her head in disgust. Their entire nation as a functioning entity was gone, or so final reports had proclaimed before the network grids crashed entirely. The only genuine news the red and blue outlets had reported in years. That certainly should have trumped the pain of a failed marriage, at least for any sane person. Maybe she was insane, or just shallow. She should have let it all go in the wake of the drop, and perhaps she would have if she'd had more than a day between discovering Phil's philandering and the attack. The knocking came faster, harder. The bowls jiggled in the drying rack. Phil the philanderer. Phil Landerer. She giggled out loud. The high-pitched sound seemed as disconnected from her as the insistent banging outside. No point going to him, and he certainly wasn't coming into the kitchen to offer solace. Her initial rejection had effectively discouraged him from reaching out to her in any meaningful way during the weeks they'd been trapped together, and whatever pride she had left kept her from initiating contact. Her giggling faded into silence. The boards over the sliding door to the patio vibrated. She wondered if they would hold it together another night. She wondered if she could. The slider used to lead to their meticulously tended half-acre lawn trimmed with azalea bushes with a weeping willow tree at its center. All gone now, torn up and knocked down by the creatures that demanded entry in the night. Thinking back on all the money and time Phil had expended on maintaining their yard because we can't be the only ones on this street with brown patches and dandelions. It was all about appearances, what the neighbors thought about them, or more specifically, him. They had to present the perfect yard, the pristine house, and the enviable marriage. What a colossal fucking joke. All that effort spent deceiving everyone, only to have it end in the rain of poison known as the drop. No one would ever know for sure whether it was the reds or the blues that struck first. Hell, considering how quickly and widely the chemicals dispersed, maybe both launched at the same time. It was no secret that the cold part of the war was about to segue into all-out fighting in the streets, so maybe each side had hoped a preemptive strike would eliminate the other. If so, they'd been partially successful, although the ultimate outcome could only be considered a draw. Everything had failed so quickly after the black rain fell for 4 days straight. That's all it had taken to destroy an entire nation, and who knew how much of Mexico and Canada? 4 short days. By then, it no longer mattered to anyone which side had resorted to chemical warfare. Only those who had been fortunate enough to be indoors survived. Anyone and anything outside had died screaming. Or at least the lucky ones had. Those that changed into nocturnal, gnarled things began their attacks almost immediately. The first night after the drop, she'd heard the cries of their next-door neighbors from the guest's bedroom. Rather than call Phil, she'd pulled the covers half over her head like a terrified child and listened as the creatures battered their way into the Goldbergs' house and ripped the entire family limb from limb. The rest of that night she'd spent breaking apart furniture with Phil in grim silence and helping him board up their house. She knew then that they had to at least cooperate, or they'd certainly die. The whole house echoed and shook under the blows raining down from all sides now. She heard more sounds, scratching, squelching, something like a bark intertwined with a starving infant's screech. Other noises she didn't have words to describe, beyond that they made the fine hairs on her body rise as though she were bathing in electricity. Phil came into the kitchen, and despite it all, she felt a surge of relief. At least he'd been home when it all came apart. During a gap between work trips, she'd originally anticipated proposing a spontaneous weekend at the shore to reconnect. Of course, that plan had taken a very different turn when she found evidence of his betrayal, for which she knew she should be thankful. Otherwise, they likely would have been outdoors when the drop occurred. Everything holding? Phil held up the candle, watching as the boards across the small window over the sink rattled. So far. She put the bowls and spoons away, then met his gaze and managed to smile. Maybe it was time, if not to forgive, to at least thaw out their private Cold War. Want to play some bridge? He hesitated, but then shook his head. Think I'm going to do a little reading, if that's okay. She tried not to feel stung. Okay, enjoy. She kept her smile pasted on until he turned and walked into the living room, then relaxed her features. One of the boards over the slider vibrated harder than the others. Was that a crack along the side? Maybe a nail had come loose. She stared at it without processing the image. Maybe I'm the unreasonable one, being so stubborn and unforgiving given the circumstances. She felt exhausted, having spent so much time in a heightened state of misery and dread. Her entire world had crumbled figuratively, and then literally within a ridiculously short time span. Still, this was the new normal, and Phil wasn't going anywhere anymore. And even if his side piece was still alive out there, she lived too far away for him to hike to her before night fell. She bit her lower lip as the cacophony of things that pounded and wailed and fought to get into their home, to tear them apart or devour them or whatever the hell they meant to accomplish, solidified her resolve. I can do this. I can make us work again. Could she, though? 20 years of pride in what she'd believed was their mutual commitment to forsake all others. She poked her fingertip into the candle flame and drew it back, and repeated the action. She had let herself believe their relationship could survive anything, even after Phil's increasingly long and frequent trips and sexual neglect made it clear their marriage was chugging off the rails. Then she decided to do some spring cleaning, 3 weeks and 1 day ago. She'd gone to tidy the small second bedroom, then back when they bought the house they had planned to make a nursery. That never came to pass, yet another deep regret in her life, although now she was grateful. She couldn't imagine the horror of going through Armageddon with a kid. Had that board come loose from the frame? It was difficult to tell in the candlelight, especially as distracted as she was. She had spotted a book while dusting, wedged between his old grad school books on the bottom shelf of the bookcase. It was a thin tome that she'd only noticed because she pulled each book out for a quick flick with her duster. The cover bore a colorful floral pattern and the title, Poems of Love and Devotion. She'd pondered it for a moment, as she had been the English major, but didn't remember owning or reading a book with that title. Then she'd opened it and read the inscription, To Shelley. She felt like she was 7 again and on her first and last roller coaster ride, right when the car reached the first precipice and hung there for a few seconds. Little Susan had peered down the impossibly steep slope ahead of her and felt utter, paralyzing fear, yet at the same time prayed that the moment would never end, because when it did, there would be nothing left but the plunge. Nevertheless, she kept reading. A book of love poems to share as we journey down love's road. Thank you for coming with me, hand in hand, side by side, along the path. I'm looking forward to many chapters of the journey. Happy anniversary, Phil. Behind her, something large struck the gutter of the house like a giant's club. At least part of it clattered to the cement patio below. She had tried to rationalize it. Well, he dated before we got together. This must be from back then, a gift he never got around to giving some girl in college. Unfortunately, Phil had taken the care to date his inscription for the Sunday later that week. Then she remembered thinking, maybe he got it for me as an anniversary present, but changed his mind and got me jewelry instead. She'd squinted at the salutation. Phil's handwriting had always been kind of sloppy. Maybe she read it wrong. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't see Sue or Susie. There was only one possible configuration of the letters: Shelley. Arguably her closest friend, the only one who knew Susan thought her marriage might be in trouble because she had finally had to confide in someone or she feared losing her mind. Shelley was so goddamn happy with her single life, doing yoga twice a week and extolling the virtues of a carb-free diet that kept her so trim. Shelley, who was still in her prime 30s instead of dulling 40s. Backstabbing bitch. She held her fingertip in the flame a little too long, singeing her flesh before pain made her pull it back with a sharp hiss. I hope you're dead. She stuck her finger in her mouth to cool it. I hope those things fucked you while they ripped that hot little body of yours to shreds. She blinked. What in the actual hell was wrong with her? There were monsters outside, and she and Phil were on their own. The other nations of the world weren't sending troops, likely grateful the threat America had become had resolved itself. Certainly the opposing dual governments were useless if any of the politicians were even still alive. And if they were likely hunkered down in palatial bunkers. No cops, no armies, no one was coming to their rescue. All they had left was each other. A nail shook loose and fell with a clatter onto the tile floor. A frisson went down her spine, yet she smiled, genuinely this time. She was finally thinking straight. It's time to focus on the here and now instead of the past. Yeah, Phil cheated. He'd had an affair with her friend, and that was shitty. But if they were going to survive, they had to become a team again, a genuine partnership. That meant they were going to have to talk, really talk, as hard as it might be. Wasn't communication a cornerstone of a healthy marriage? They could learn a lesson from all this. The Union of States had fallen apart because both sides lost the ability to communicate. But maybe her union could still be salvaged. Picking up the nail from the floor, she headed into the living room. Phil, this came out of the slide. Susan stopped. Her entire body flashed hot for a moment, then just as quickly cooled. Phil sat cross-legged in front of the fireplace, hugging a book to his chest with his eyes closed and head bowed. In the flickering firelight, she could see its floral cover. Apparently, he hadn't heard her over the incessant battering that echoed and shook their home. She turned around and went back into the kitchen. She set the nail down on the countertop and sat on one of the remaining kitchen chairs. That damned book was one of the first ones I put on the stack to be burnt. Phil must have rescued it when she wasn't looking. Another nail fell and rolled next to her foot. She gazed at the boards across the slider. At least one had wholly separated from the door frame. Something long, hooked, and dripping slid into the narrow gap between board and frame and began worrying its way inside. She knew she should care, but she just didn't. Thank you very much.